Welcome to Libeth. I'm glad you're here. This week we are in Heian, Japan, with the tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu. Begin not with a plot summary, but with a quality the book makes visible at once. A court that arranges people like costumes on a stage, and then calls the arrangement life. The first pages give the pattern plainly. A young woman favored until envy corrodes her, the emperor sheltering her love while the palace conspires to grind her down. And when she dies, a proclamation is read over her bier that lifts her rank a degree as if a title could alter the fall. The mournful choreography around that death, the emperor secluded, courtiers whispering, a mother whose grief blends shame with public honors, is not simply a tale of loss. It is a demonstration of how power in this world builds identities outward from what others will acknowledge. That sheltering affection, which seems like intimacy, turns instead into a public identity bestowed and policed. And in that contradiction, loneliness begins to show itself as an achievement of structure rather than the absence of company. Loneliness in this world is not the result of being alone. It is the result of being entirely surrounded by people who see not you, but what you represent, and who respond not to what you feel, but to what your rank requires you to perform. That is a more precise form of isolation than solitude, and the court manufactures it with extraordinary consistency. Power here positions itself through ceremonial visibility and enforced distance. The emperor's love can shelter the favored woman from harm, and at the same time expose her to a more corrosive isolation, because favor makes her a token to be defended and a token to be resented. The palace answers feeling with rank. A funeral proclamation promotes the dead lady. The emperor's continual visits mark her presence, and servants shuttle between houses to carry back scraps of this sanctioned affection. Those public acts of elevation, gifts from the treasury, a posthumous rank, make identity legible to others, but they also bind a person to the roles those public gestures require. Power in the tale fashions a person by what it confers and what it withdraws, and because the conferral is always mediated by proclamations, by gift, by ceremonial appointment, the person so made is never only a self, but a public performance waiting for its audience. The self that exists before it is recognized has no social weight. It must be constituted by others' acts of acknowledgement before it can act in the world. This leads the narrative voice of the court toward a tone that cannot decide between lament and celebration, because every expression of feeling must be translated into the medium the court accepts. A private sorrow will be turned into poetry and public ritual. A love becomes a sequence of envy messages and fittings of garments. An absence becomes a procession. Listen to the emperor after Kiritsubo's death, whose nights are racked by memory, and who sends a girl with a poem about more winds to plead with the dead woman's mother. Even this direct plea is mediated by a messenger and a verse. Or consider the way Genji's encounters are staged. An image seen through a lattice, a fan left as a token, a cloak surrendered and then returned by verses. The court's voice is an apparatus for emotion, and the apparatus decides form. That indecision between grief and ritual celebration produces a tone of elegiac formality where tears and ornament are inseparable. And the novel lets you feel how grief, parceled into correct forms, loses its untidy immediacy even as it acquires its public meaning. The ceremonies are not false. They are honest expressions of a world in which all emotion has passed through social form before arriving at its destination. Within that apparatus, direct speech grows scarce, and the etiquette itself becomes a barrier. Intimacy in Genji's world is often postponed into performance. Lovers write poems and let servants carry them. Feelings are coded in the choice of perfumed scarves, in the season a visit is made, in whether a screen is left slightly open. The novel keeps showing how language is never simply speech here. It is a system with registers. The quiver-bearer's girl who brings the emperor's appeal carries not only a note, but the authority and anxiety wrapped in it. Utsusemi hides behind doors and permits only a boy to ferry messages. Yugao's fan, found and answered, is a whole vocabulary of identity in a few strokes of ink. Because speech must pass through intermediaries, attendants, poems, ritual days, people can never simply say what they feel, and that enforced mediation makes the feeling itself lean toward abstraction. What is felt clearly at the moment of feeling arrives at its recipient translated, delayed, and inflected by the conventions of the medium through which it has passed. The court processes emotion the way a bureaucracy processes a petition. Formally, at a measured pace, in the required form, stripped of its urgency. Objects become speech in the tale. Clothing, incense, handwriting, fans, combs, the precise manner in which a sash is returned at a funeral. Each of these is a social signature that stands for a person. Genji notes it when he sees a fan with a moon motif, or when a scarf carries the perfume of a vanished night. Others read rank in the cut of a robe, or the fact that a child is presented at court with the putting on of the trousers ritual. The priest's neat prose, the careless but breeding hand that pens a reply, the way a present is wrapped, all of these become the language by which the court recognizes you or denies you. The novel lets the reader watch identity being assembled from these external signs, until it is hard to tell whether the person exists apart from the things that signal them. This is the proto-blogging dimension of the tale. The court produced a culture of attentive observation because observation was survival. What you noticed, what you recorded, how you described, these were demonstrations of competence, and competence was rank, and rank was the only security available. Murasaki Shikibu's own diary is part of the same tradition. The lady-in-waiting who does not notice precisely enough will eventually be overlooked. Timing and seasonality make intimacy into a performance you must wait for. Meetings come by the permission of the stars. The Earth Star forbids a return, and the result is an excuse later used to explain absence. And the moonlight becomes a stage light that makes some encounters possible and others impossible. Genji's furtive night visits, Utsusemi's strategic departures, the reluctant gift exchanges that occur only when the moon is right. All these scenes show how relationships are scheduled and how waiting becomes the main substance of a woman's life in the palace. The women of the inner rooms are subject to a temporality that structures them into seasons of anticipation and ritualized response, so that emotion grows not by unmediated presence, but by the long arch of absence punctuated by ceremonious returns. The waiting is not passive. It is a form of labor that demands constant readiness, constant management of one's emotional state, so that when the visit finally comes, the performance is flawless. A woman who has spent months waiting must appear, at the moment of encounter, as if she has not been waiting at all. That enforced waiting increases sensitivity, and in doing so intensifies the felt distance between people. The more refined the rules, the more acute the attention they demand, and the finer the sensibility becomes about any sign of change. A shifted tone in a verse, a blade of incense used in the wrong place, a delayed messenger. The emperor's memory of his lost lady, the patient watching over a child he has not seen, The way Genji finds himself obsessing over a scarf or a half-heard poem. Refinement sharpens perception and turns every small omission into a wound. The novel makes you feel how that refinement is a double-edged thing. It enhances aesthetic perception, and it amplifies loneliness by making every absence a meaningful absence. The highly refined sensibility has no buffer between itself and the social world. Every slight passes directly to the quick. What looks like sensitivity is also extreme vulnerability, and what looks like vulnerability is also the proof of superior cultivation. The court wants both things simultaneously, and the result is a world in which everyone is exquisitely attuned and chronically in pain. Loneliness in Genji rarely shows up as a literal vacancy of human presence. It emerges from the absence of unmediated selfhood. Genji is surrounded by people who admire him, by courtiers who measure their own luck by whether they have his notice. And yet, he is universally admired and privately misunderstood. His very charm attracts attendance and attention, and at the same time isolates him, because to be publicly adored is to become a thing others project upon. No one is allowed the careless, unsignified access that would let his inwardness breathe. This is why his brightest hour on stage, the dance of the blue waves or the praise that follows his poem, leaves him inwardly empty, because applause binds him into the role other people have made for him. The court's attentions build his reputation, but also build a shell around the possibility of a self that is not performed for an audience. He is the most visible person in the palace. He is also the most alone. That combination is not accidental. Visibility requires performance, and performance, however skilled, is the opposite of presence. Women feel this with an even sharper geometry, because their identity in the novel is relational rather than autonomous. A woman's visibility depends on father, husband, child, and patronage. A daughter is admitted to court according to what her father's rank allows. A wife becomes significant mostly by her husband's attention, and a mother can become visible retroactively if her child rises. Think of the dead Kiritsubo woman. Her father is gone, her mother has no guardian's power, and yet the emperor's affection temporarily makes her a figure of the court, and then, after death, a proclamation. Think of the nun who shelters Murasaki's child. Her household's poverty makes the girl invisible until Genji performs a maneuver of recognition that transforms the child's fate. The economy of recognition here is relational and performative, and so the person inside those relations is always mediated by the rank markers around her. The question of who she might be independent of those markers is not a question the court can ask, because independent of those markers, she is simply not visible. Genji himself exists between categories. He is of imperial blood, yet denied imperial destiny. He becomes Minamoto by that careful, politically conscious act of naming, and that adoption signals both freedom and dispossession. Structural liminality yields a particular kind of freedom, the flexibility to move between ranks, patrons, lovers, and an equal kind of instability, because without a single secure position, other people's definitions press in. The novel maps how liminality can be creative and precarious at once, and how identity here is a shifting architecture rather than a fixed core. Genji does not know who he is except in relation to who he is with. His sense of self is constituted anew in each encounter, which gives him enormous social flexibility and makes permanent intimacy impossible. He cannot be truly known, because he is always in the process of being constituted by whoever is currently looking at him. into that architecture education becomes a tool of identity manufacture. Murasaki is the clearest example. She is not merely loved for what she is. She is shaped deliberately into a companion. The priest and the nun, the tutor, Koremitsu, all these figures take part in turning a child into an appropriate social presence, literally teaching her the hand that will be read as gentility, the poems that will pass as taste, the responsiveness that will mark her as suitable company. Genji's own instruction of her reads as an act of design. He wants a responsive self, trained to mirror and embellish the sensibility that the court values. Education here is not neutral cultivation, but identity production, a process that replaces spontaneous self-expression with a crafted responsiveness meant to radiate the right signs. The cruelty of this is that the person who emerges from this process is genuinely herself. Murasaki's character is real. Her feelings are real. And yet every component of that character was installed by someone else's vision of what she should be. The question of where Murasaki ends and Genji's project begins has no answer, because they were formed simultaneously. Remove that scaffolding, and the dependence it hides becomes painfully visible. The palace is an aesthetic insulation. Exile or desolation sends people out of that comfortable frame, and the fiction makes the consequences manifest. Yugao's death is a stark example. Away from court protection, lodged in a narrow street among shabby houses, she dies suddenly and alone. The garden pond, the shabby shutters, the ill-kept lodging. The setting exposes how little of her vitality the court's classificatory honors could actually save. In the novel's later pages, this fracture between aesthete and world becomes more explicit. When people are stripped of the courtly stage, the cultivated self unravels in contact with the rawness of life, and the book insists that the self was always assembled by audience as much as by inward will. Identity requires its witnesses. Remove the witnesses, and what is left is not a revealed true self, but the sudden exposure of how provisional the self always was. Polygyny intensifies the same structural problem. Affection, divided among many, becomes intermittent and politically strategic. Visits are scheduled, not freely given. A husband's attention is always allocated. A wife's emotional continuity is impossible because the social economy forces men and women into a drama of relation changes. Women learn to wait as their main resource, and waiting becomes a life practice that substitutes for participation. The result is that intimacy is delayed into performance. A poem sent at the right hour, a fan left with a folded message, a cloak presented and accepted. The novel keeps bringing us back to that engine. Intimacy deferred, then poured into formal exchange. The exchange is not empty. It carries genuine feeling. But feeling carried in formal exchange is feeling that has been processed, that has been made safe for circulation. And what is made safe for circulation has also been made unable to do the thing that unmediated feeling can do, which is to change the person who receives it. So the tale does not resolve loneliness into a lesson. It makes loneliness legible as the byproduct of a social order that prizes visible sign over unmediated presence, that produces selves through ritual recognition, and that asks affection to pass through forms before it may be acknowledged. The book keeps showing how refinement and sensitivity amplify distance, how waiting becomes the principal occupation of those who live by another's attention, how education shapes identity into a serviceable instrument, and how exile or death reveal the dependence on the fragile scaffolding of recognition. It leaves you with patterns rather than solutions, an anatomy of loneliness and identity performed day by day in the palace's half-light, and an unrelenting curiosity about whether any unmediated self can survive in a world so insistently arranged by other people's eyes. The answer the novel suggests, through the accumulation of its episodes and the weight of its silences, is probably not, and that the cost of that probable impossibility is what the court calls refinement, and what the book, with precise and pitiless beauty, calls the human price of civilization. But the book does not simply condemn. It is also, genuinely, a celebration of what human beings can make when they commit to the cultivation of sensitivity. The poems are beautiful, the dances are magnificent, the acts of aesthetic care that pass between people are real forms of love, even if they are also instruments of control. Murasaki Shikibu does not offer us a simple verdict, because she understands that the thing she is describing is both terrible and extraordinary, and that the terrible and the extraordinary are in this case inseparable. The court that breaks its people is also the court that makes the people who can feel their breaking with this much precision, and write about it with this much grace. And that is a paradox the novel holds open without resolving, because to resolve it would be to betray the experience of everyone who lived inside it. The observation that generates all of this, the close, accumulative noticing of the court's daily machinery, is itself the book's most radical act. To observe precisely is to accumulate evidence. To accumulate evidence is to construct an argument. And Murasaki's argument, built from 1,000 small observations about who was seated where, which poem was sent at what hour, whose carriage was admitted to which gate, amounts to a comprehensive account of how a civilization produces and destroys the people it most prizes. That this argument was made in the domestic script, in the feminine register, by a woman in the wardrobe, makes it all the more precise. She had access to exactly the level of evidence the argument required. She saw not the official record, but the daily fact. And the daily fact, accumulated over years, reveals the structure that the official record was designed to conceal. That revelation is the gift the tale of Genji offers its readers across 1,000 years. Not the official story of a civilization, but the unofficial one, told from behind a screen, in the language of waiting, in the grammar of the deferred and the mediated, with a precision that the official language could never have achieved, because it was too busy performing what it was supposed to be rather than recording what it was. That's all for today on Libeth. If you want to follow the whole journey, subscribe, one new book every week. At least we try.